Welcome, Yochai Benkler, to Barcelona.
Happy to be here.
Very happy that we have you here. In this interview, we would like that you help us to actually rethink how far the commons can be a source of inspiration and as a model for the challenges that actually we have in the city. So first, I would like to ask you to introduce a commons framework and the commons tradition as such.
So I'm very happy to be here in Barcelona, one of the more exciting places in the world to think today about the commons. Probably the most exciting, actually. The commons is an institutional arrangement, a set of laws, practices, norms that allow people to govern together how they economically produce. Really, there are two major schools of thought that developed primarily since the early 90s, some in the late 80s. One is associated with the famous political scientist Elinor Ostrom, and it developed by studying very carefully irrigation districts, for example, in Spain, pastures in Switzerland or Japan, around the world. And the most important insight of that class of work was that the underlying idea behind the neoliberal transformation, that collective action fails and you need markets to get people to coordinate only through markets, only through property and contract. And otherwise people can't get together. There's just a tragedy of the commons. And this work showed that in practice, on the ground, for hundreds of years, people were able to come together, not with government regulation, not with prices in markets, but to collaborate and manage their economy more effectively and more sustainably than was the case whenever governments tried to come in and turn it into a property and contract system. The second major tradition emerged from digital networks and from free and open source software, from Wikipedia, from unlicensed wireless and spectrum, a whole class of work that basically said commons are not just about these smaller irrigation districts or pastures with long histories. They are a central part of what the modern economy is. Commons are about any resource that people can share together without anyone having exclusive rights to say, this is mine and not yours. In this case, commons is the opposite of property. Instead of saying the only way we can manage this resource is by saying this person has the rights, everybody has to have contracts with them, and the only thing we can rely on are markets, we say instead, it's like the open roads. As long as you follow the rules, everybody can use the roads. It's like the public square. As long as you follow the rules, everybody can use it. And it turns out, when you look at innovation, when you look at communication and unlicensed wireless and Wi-Fi, when you look at even markets and trade that depend on commons in roads, commons in squares, commons in international waterways, you need commons in order to be innovative and creative. And what happened was, as the economy put the core means of production, computers, storage, communications, in the hands of the entire population, and as the rate of innovation and uncertainty increased, commons became a much more important part of the very cutting edge of the most advanced economies. And so these two schools came together and essentially taught us over the last 15 years or so that the basic ideology behind the 40 years of deregulation and privatization, that you need markets based on property and or contract, otherwise you will be stagnant, is false. Instead, people can come together, people can use resources together, and by doing that and combining how they learn to use them together and this decentralized learning, you actually get more innovation and more creativity.
Thank you. Regarding the political sphere, how far, what would be the interpretation that you would do on the commons regarding its political implication and the type of political lessons that can be extracted from it, from the perspective of a city, Barcelona, which is actually governed by a party which is called Barcelona Comú. So how far do you think the commons are actually like a political modality or can be read in these terms?
So there are two very different ways to think politically about the commons. The first one is about communication. If you think of 20th century mass media communication, they were relatively concentrated, either in the hands of state-owned media or in the hands of commercial advertising-supported media. And there was always a strong criticism of the media as concentrating the debate and creating only one discourse. One of the things the commons has allowed is much more decentralized production. Many more points of view can be intensely held and then transmitted to the world. Some of this you can agree with, some of it not. The rise of the right-wing media in the United States is very much dependent on there being a media commons that anyone can access and then amplifying the voices. You don't have to agree with the views. What you get is radical decentralization of opinions, both things you agree with and things you disagree with. And that's by itself important for discourse, but can also be dangerous if it's taken over by a populism that's very ethnocentric and nationalist. The second, and this is important, and it's important to create open access platforms to make sure that everybody has that connection, everybody can produce the communications, everyone can create materials. It's important to create a relative commons in cultural materials so people can remix and recreate their own messages in powerful ways to communicate with other people. And there's a whole set of commons strategies that go into building this open discourse platform. The second is really the question of whether you can use, on one hand, the lessons from the old school of the commons, the Ostrom school of the commons about collective action, and the new lessons from online participation and online self-governance in platforms like, or most importantly, in peer production practices like Wikipedia, like the Debian community in the GNU Linux, in the Linux kernel development and GNU Linux distribution. The models of self-governance that we see that actually say politics is not about once in a blue moon, every 4 years, every 2 years you go and vote, but politics is something that's much more of an ongoing citizen participation, the ability to create participatory budgets, the ability to have the party connect directly with its voters. And that's a whole class of interventions that are intended to make citizens less than just consumers of government services, but active participants in the discourse. And this is also not always great, right? There are advantages of representative democracy and concerns about populism and plebiscite, and there are at the same time the sense of continuing engagement. So I think what's important is to design participatory platforms in ways that engage people, but not assume that just opening up and letting everybody talk is going to result in something good. We always need rules and structures for the commons, no less than for property. The critical point is without the asymmetry of power. That's the critical focus.
Mm-hmm. And the third dimension I would like you to ask you to reflect is in the commons as an economical modality. How far we can rethink the current economical system from the base of the possibilities that open the commons.
So I think the commons serves several important roles in challenging the present, let's call it the Davos consensus of how to run an economy. First of all, it tells us that we're not the Homo economicus, very narrow-minded, only material, self-interested, focused person. We are much more complicated. We're more socially engaged. We care about many more things than just material self-interest. It tells us that when we operate in enterprises that actually engage our social motivations, that become something that's meaningful to us and not just a way of making money, we are more innovative. We are more creative in our own work, and it doesn't matter. More innovative might be I'm working as a delivery person. I'm working in the ground crew of an airline, and I care enough to know that actually if I moved things 2 meters to the left, it would work better. But the supervisor thinks it needs to be here. If you are either more participatory or less, means I care more or less. So there is enormous scope for increased democracy and participation throughout workplaces. No less important, even more important, is the possibility of creating collaborative, participatory, and cooperative models across the entire economy. There's no inherent limit on what can be done through partial commons or full commons. When you think of it, here's the thing. If you think of commons as these precious, rare things like a farming community somewhere, a farmer cooperative, you have a misunderstanding of how basic commons are to the infrastructure. If you think if you think of commons as primarily everything in which no one has asymmetric power to say you get to use this, you don't, but rather we all share the resource based on some collaborative model, we already have enormously powerful commons that we don't count because we don't know how to measure them. So you have very good measures of the contribution to GDP of railroads because people pay for tickets. You don't have the same measures for roads, except toll roads where people pay measures. But that's an enormous contribution to GDP. You don't have any measurement for the contribution of Wi-Fi to GDP because there aren't transactions. So when you look at wireless, you think it's only the carriers, it's not all the Wi-Fi. But most of the data is covered in Wi-Fi. Most of healthcare uses unlicensed wireless. Most of smart grid communications use unlicensed wireless. So wireless commons today carries much more traffic than property-based spectrum, and yet we count only this and we don't count this. So the first problem we have is that we don't understand that we actually are sitting inside commons all around us without noticing them, and we only focus very narrowly on the property without understanding that it's sitting immersed in commons. So the first thing we need to do is just count, begin to understand how central the commons are. The second thing we need to do is we need to expand. So if you look, for example, today at small and medium enterprises, they exist within a framework that already offers quite a bit of public services based in the commons, like the road system, like the legal system. But they could do a lot more in terms of shared purchasing, shared financial sources, shared banking. None of that today necessarily exists in any consistent way, and yet it could all be solved on models of commons. So the critical thing to understand is that the commons is a frame through which to see all economic production. And that frame is in fundamental opposition to the frame that has narrowed the view to only one institutional model. How do I privatize? How do I create property? How do I assure contracts? Instead of, how do I manage this resource in the way that maximizes the innovation and creativity, maximizes the participation, and gives the most degrees of freedom for people who are part of the practice to manage their own lives. Once you make that shift, You need to go sector by sector, resource by resource, and say, how do I build this in a way that gives everybody who participates equal power to govern themselves in this context? And the sectors that we have been able to measure, like spectrum, like roadways, like free and open source software, the commons have been enormously productive. And that's really the potential we're trying to harness here.
Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure.